Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to be looking at the psychology of war.
Oh, wow.
But
That's a deep study topic.
yeah, it's not as dry as it sounds.
Yeah.
We're really going to be talking about how our minds work when conflict feels inevitable.
I think we've all been there.
Yeah, and I think the insights we get from this can help us understand not only current events, but even our own decision-making processes.
Absolutely. And what's so interesting about this is we're not just talking military strategy. We're talking about the cognitive biases that can take over.
Right.
Even in the most brilliant minds when the pressure's on.
Yeah.
And that impacts all of our decisions.
Exactly. And our guide for this is going to be a fascinating research article called The Rubicon Theory of War.
I love this theory.
Yeah.
It's so interesting because it really helps explain why leaders, even when facing seemingly impossible odds, often become more confident about going to war the closer it gets.
Yeah, it's counterintuitive.
It's counterintuitive, you would think.
You'd think they'd be more cautious.
Yeah. More hesitant, but often it's the reverse.
Well, how do we explain that? Well, the theory itself gets its name from Julius Caesar
Of course.
and his famous crossing of the Rubicon River
The die is cast.
back in 49 BC.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, the die is cast. And so the Rubicon Theory of War uses this as a metaphor. The authors of this article say there's a point in any conflict where you switch from deliberating about whether to fight to actually implementing that decision to fight.
Right. It's that commitment point,
Yeah.
and everything changes.
So to illustrate this, think about like buying a new car.
Okay.
In the deliberative phase, you're researching online, you're reading reviews, maybe test driving a few cars. You're weighing your options, you're considering all sides of it.
Right, you're being very careful.
But then you walk into the dealership and you see that shiny new car in your favorite color.
Ooh.
And suddenly you're in the implemental phase.
Yeah.
You've made the decision to buy, and now your brain is laser focused on how to make that happen.
And all those concerns about the budget, the gas mileage.
It all goes out the window.
It fades away.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because in this implemental phase, our brains start to play tricks on us.
Oh, no.
Yeah. We become vulnerable to all these cognitive biases that can warp our perception of reality.
So you're saying we're all just victims of our brains, that free will is an illusion.
Well, not exactly. It's more nuanced than that. But the research has identified 6 specific biases that kick in when war feels imminent.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me about these biases.
All right, so the first one is called reduced receptivity to new information.
Okay.
And it basically means that once we've crossed that mental Rubicon, we start tuning out anything that contradicts our decision to fight.
Oh, so it's like we've already made up our minds.
Exactly. It's like we put on noise-canceling headphones, but for our brains.
So if you've convinced yourself that war is the only option,
Yeah.
you're probably not going to be very open to hearing reasons why it might be a bad idea.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we have biased processing of information, which is where even if we do let in some new information, we twist it to fit our pre-existing beliefs.
So it's not just ignoring information, it's actively spinning it.
We emphasize anything that supports our decision to fight and downplay anything that doesn't.
Oh, we're masters of self-deception.
There are. And this leads to the third bias, increased vulnerability to cognitive dissonance. You know, that uncomfortable feeling we get when we hold 2 conflicting beliefs at the same time?
Yeah.
Well, to reduce this dissonance, we double down on our justifications for war.
We're just trying to make ourselves feel better.
Yes, convincing ourselves even more that we're doing the right thing.
So our brains are really good at protecting us from doubt.
They are. And it goes even further than that because that leads to the fourth bias, self-serving evaluations.
With that.
This is where we start to overestimate our own abilities and underestimate the enemy's. We're suddenly convinced we have the superior strategy, the better soldiers, the unwavering public support.
Also, we're basically delusional.
It's a recipe for overconfidence. And, you know, we've all experienced this in our own lives.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure we could all think of times when we were overconfident.
Exactly. It doesn't have to be war.
Right.
And that brings us to the fifth bias, the illusion of control. This is where we start to believe we have way more control over this situation than we actually do.
So in the context of war, this might mean underestimating the potential for unexpected events.
Right. Unforeseen consequences, bad luck.
It's like thinking you can control a hurricane.
Exactly. And finally, we have the sixth bias, overly optimistic expectations about the outcome. This is where the overconfidence really kicks into overdrive. We convince ourselves that victory is not only possible, but probable, even if the odds are stacked against us.
So we've got 6 biases all working together, creating this mental echo chamber
Yeah.
where we become increasingly detached from reality.
And the Rubicon theory argues that this collective surge in overconfidence is a major driver of conflict.
Particularly in situations where war might have been avoidable. But how do we know this is actually happening in the real world? I mean, we can't get inside the heads of historical figures, can we?
Well, the authors of this research actually delve into a case study
Yeah.
that's both incredibly fascinating and relevant World War I. It's a perfect example of how this overconfidence, fueled by these 6 cognitive biases, can have devastating consequences on a global scale.
Okay, let's dive into that historical test case.
Let's start with the Central Powers, specifically Austria-Hungary. In the months leading up to June 1914, the possibility of war with Serbia was certainly on their radar, but it wasn't a foregone conclusion. They were still in that deliberative phase.
So what changed?
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914, that was the Rubicon moment for Austria-Hungary.
That was it?
Within 48 hours, the leadership had made the decision to attack Serbia.
Wow.
They seemingly threw caution to the wind.
And that's where those biases come in.
Exactly. The fear of a wider European war, particularly with Russia, which had been a major concern before,
Right.
it was suddenly downplayed, almost completely ignored. The leadership was so focused on the perceived weakness of Serbia that they overlooked the potential for a much larger conflict.
So they basically convinced themselves that a war with Serbia would be a quick and easy win,
Yeah.
and overlooked the huge risk of Russia getting involved? Classic overconfidence.
What about Germany? Weren't they a bit more hesitant?
Their path to war was a little more complex, but as July 1914 went on and the crisis escalated, their sense that war was inevitable grew.
Oh.
And with it, you guessed it, their confidence.
So even though they weren't the ones who started the fight, they got caught up in that same wave of overconfidence.
That's right. And what's even more interesting is that this overconfidence wasn't just limited to their overall assessment of the war. It also influenced their military planning. For years, the German general staff had been warning about the need to prepare for a long and difficult war. But as the conflict got closer, they completely abandoned those cautious plans.
Wait, so they knew it could be a long, drawn-out war, but they just ignored that? It's like those warnings faded into the background once they crossed that mental Rubicon.
Wow.
Instead, they opted for a quick and decisive offensive, clinging to the belief that they could achieve a swift victory.
I'm sensing a pattern here. It's like once the decision to fight is made, all those practical details, the potential for a long and messy conflict, they all just kind of disappear. It's all about that initial push for victory.
And this pattern, it wasn't limited to the Central Powers. The Entente powers, specifically Russia, France, and Britain, they followed a very similar trajectory, although with some interesting nuances.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Yeah, so we were talking about how both sides in World War I, the Central Powers and the Entente, they ended up falling prey to that same overconfidence as war became more and more likely.
Right, and it's not like those biases magically disappeared once the fighting actually started.
Oh, definitely not. In fact, you can probably guess that initial wave of optimism, that belief in a quick and decisive victory.
Yeah.
It didn't last very long for anyone.
I can only imagine.
Yeah. The reality of modern warfare, with its brutal trenched warfare and massive casualties that set in pretty quickly.
Right. It's one thing to imagine a glorious victory, and quite another to be stuck in a muddy trench with bullets flying overhead.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Even in the face of this horrifying new reality, the effects of those implemental mindsets, those biases we've been talking about,
Yeah.
they didn't just vanish.
So those mental blinders, they stayed on, even when the situation on the ground was completely different from what they'd imagined.
Think about it this way. We talked about reduced receptivity to new information, right?
Right.
Well, that continued to shape how leaders interpreted what was happening on the battlefield.
Give me an example. Help me picture how this actually played out.
Okay, take the Battle of the Marne in September 1914. The German advance was halted by the French and British. A big blow to their plans for a quick victory, right?
Right.
But instead of taking a step back and reevaluating their strategy, what did the German high command do? They doubled down. They clung to the belief that they could still force a breakthrough.
So even when faced with clear evidence that their plan wasn't working, they just couldn't let go of that initial overconfidence. It's like they were trapped in their own heads.
And it's not like this was just a German problem. The French, even though they'd been successful at the Marne, they also showed a similar reluctance to change their strategy.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They were so committed to their offensive doctrine, launching attack after attack, even though they were costly and ultimately didn't achieve much.
So it's almost like both sides were so fixated on their initial war plans, so convinced of their eventual victory, that they couldn't or wouldn't see what was really happening. They were
Yeah.
fighting the war. They thought they were fighting, not the war that was actually unfolding.
You got it. And the longer the war went on, the more deeply entrenched those biases became. Remember the illusion of control?
Mhm.
That persisted, leading to decisions that, looking back, seem completely illogical.
Okay, you've got to give me a concrete example here.
Yeah.
Because right now it just sounds like we're saying that people made bad decisions. I need to see the Rubicon Theory in action.
All right, let's look at the Battle of Verdun in 1916, a truly horrifying battle. The German chief of staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, he launched this massive offensive with the goal of what he called bleeding France white. He was convinced that by inflicting huge casualties, he could force the French to surrender no matter the cost to his own troops.
That's just chilling. It's like he was treating human lives like pieces on a chessboard.
And I'm sure you can guess it didn't exactly work out the way he planned. The battle became a nightmare with hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. And while Falkenhayn might have initially believed he could control the outcome, the reality is that the battle turned into a senseless bloodbath. It achieved very little in terms of actual strategic gains.
So a tragic example of how overconfidence mixed with that illusion of control can lead to decisions that are not only bad from a military standpoint, but morally horrific.
And this brings us back to the bias of self-serving evaluations, which played a role throughout the war.
Break that down for me. How did that show up in the leaders' decisions?
Well, when things went wrong, when they suffered setbacks, they often blamed those setbacks on external factors. Bad luck, the weather, the incompetence of their subordinates, anything but their own strategic thinking.
So they never took responsibility.
But on the flip side, any victories they did achieve, those were seen as proof of their brilliance, further fueling that sense of their own infallibility.
So even in the midst of this horrific, unprecedented conflict, their egos remained intact.
Yeah.
They were able to hold on to that belief in their own rightness.
And that unwillingness to admit their own mistakes, to actually learn from their failures, well, that only made things worse. It prolonged the suffering and contributed to the war's immense cost in human life.
This is heavy stuff, but I'm also starting to see how these insights from the Rubicon Theory go way beyond World War I. It feels like it gives us a framework for understanding how leaders make decisions under pressure in all kinds of situations.
Right.
A political crisis, a business deal gone wrong, even just a heated argument with a family member.
You're getting it. This theory isn't just about the past. It's about equipping ourselves to make better decisions right now in our own lives.
Which leads to the question I'm sure is on everyone's mind. If our brains are basically wired to become overconfident when we feel threatened, is there anything we can actually do about it? Are we doomed to repeat these mistakes?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we'll tackle head-on in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, I want to leave you with this. Recognizing that these biases exist, that we're all susceptible to them, that's the first step toward breaking free.
So stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore some potential solutions and discuss what we can all learn from the Rubicon Theory of War. See you soon.
Welcome back to our deep dive on the Rubicon Theory of War. We've talked about how our brains can trick us into feeling overconfident, and we saw how that played out in World War I.
Right. And now for the big question. Can we actually escape these mental traps?
Yeah, can we break free from overconfidence when the pressure's on?
Well, the good news is, while we can't completely eliminate these biases...
We can learn to lessen their impact.
Okay.
So the research actually gives us some strategies.
Okay.
The first and most important thing,
Yeah.
awareness is key. Just knowing that these biases exist, that they're not some flaw in other people,
Yeah.
but something we're all susceptible to, that's huge.
So it's like a mental checklist.
Yeah.
Before I make a big decision, I should ask myself, am I feeling super confident about this because it's a good idea? Or is it my implemental mindset taking over?
Exactly. And once you've acknowledged that potential for bias, then the next step is to actively seek out different perspectives.
Oh.
This is so important.
So don't just surround yourself with people who agree with you all the time.
Right. That's how you get stuck in an echo chamber.
So you're saying I should go out of my way to find people who disagree with me. That sounds a little uncomfortable.
It might be, but it's also incredibly valuable. Look for people who will challenge your assumptions.
Okay.
Question your conclusions. Offer alternative viewpoints. Think about all those biases we talked about, like reduced receptivity to new information.
Right.
Having those dissenting voices around you can help break through those mental barriers.
So it's like having a devil's advocate.
Exactly.
Someone who pokes holes in my ideas and forces me to consider all sides.
And it's not just about listening to different opinions, it's about really taking those perspectives into account when you make a decision. Don't just dismiss them because they make you uncomfortable. Weigh them carefully.
Right. Consider their merit.
Exactly. So you're talking about a culture of open debate, constructive criticism,
Yeah.
a place where questioning the status quo isn't a bad thing.
It's how we get to the best solution.
It's essential for making good decisions.
Okay, so that's one strategy. What else can we do?
So another strategy the research points to is something called implemental intentions.
Implemental intentions. What's that?
It sounds a bit technical, but it's a really simple idea. It's
Yeah.
about setting up concrete, specific plans for how you'll respond. IF. Certain things happen.
So it's not just hoping for the best, but actively preparing for things to go wrong.
Exactly. And this pre-planning can really help you avoid making impulsive, emotion-driven decisions in the heat of the moment.
I see. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine a company that's launching a new product. Instead of just focusing on all the great things that could happen, they create an implemental intention for what they'll do if sales fall short of expectations.
Okay, so if sales are bad, then what?
Exactly. They might say, if we haven't hit our sales targets by this date, we'll implement Plan B.
Okay.
And Plan B involves...
And then they have a specific course of action already figured out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
By having that predetermined plan in place, they're less likely to panic and make reactive decisions or throw more resources into a failing strategy.
So they're not just free-falling if things go south.
Right. They have a safety net.
Okay, that makes sense.
What else?
Well, there's another technique. I know the name sounds a bit morbid, but it's called a pre-mortem.
A pre-mortem? That sounds kind of scary.
It's not as scary as it sounds.
It's a super effective way to challenge those overly optimistic expectations.
Okay,
So you get your team together and imagine that the project has completely failed.
so you're planning for failure.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And then you brainstorm all the reasons why it might have gone wrong.
Oh, that's interesting.
What were the blind spots? Where did things go off track?
I like that.
This forces you to confront those potential problems that you might otherwise have missed in all the excitement of planning.
So it's like a mental dress rehearsal for disaster.
Exactly.
Right.
And by thinking through those potential points of failure ahead of time, you can avoid them or at least have backup plans for how to respond if they happen.
I love these strategies. It's so much more proactive.
And remember, these strategies aren't just for individuals. Institutions can play a role too.
Oh, yeah.
Well, by establishing procedures that encourage debate, dissent, critical analysis.
Okay, so building safeguards into the system.
Right. And it's also about nurturing a culture of humility,
Yeah.
recognizing that none of us have all the answers.
We all make mistakes.
Right. And the best way to avoid them is to be open to feedback, to new information, and even to the possibility that we might be wrong.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. We explored how our brains can trick us into overconfidence. We saw how that played out in World War I, and now we have some practical strategies for counteracting those biases.
And remember, these lessons aren't just for world leaders or military strategists. They're for all of us.
Yeah, no matter what challenges we're facing.
Right. Whether you're making a big decision, negotiating a contract, or having a difficult conversation with a loved one, recognizing these biases can help you navigate those situations with more clarity, more empathy, and ultimately more success.
So the next time you find yourself feeling 100% certain about something, especially when the stakes are high, remember the Rubicon Theory of War.
Take a step back.
Question your assumptions.
Seek out diverse perspectives.
It might just save you from making a choice you'll regret.
And who knows, maybe by putting these insights into practice, we can all contribute to creating a world with fewer conflicts.
That's a goal worth striving for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Rubicon Theory of War. Be sure to share your thoughts, any questions in the comments, and until next time, keep diving deep.